Hello, everyone. I am Rick Thomas, and I am doing a review of the Christianity Today podcast series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. This particular review is episode number 8. And in this episode from Christianity Today, they interview Joshua Harris, the former Christian. And I put that in air quotes because honestly, I'm confused about the whole matter. A long time ago, Josh Harris said that he was a believer, and that's great. We rejoice with him. A few years ago, he said he wasn't a believer anymore, and he walked away from the faith. That's too mysterious for me, and so I'm fully comfortable in resting in God's goodness and God's ability to sort that out. But I do put the word Christian in air quotes because, quite honestly, I have no idea the condition of Joshua's soul. But Christianity Today, in their Rise and Fall of Mars Hill series, interviewed Josh, and you may be familiar with him from the book that he wrote called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Now, admittedly, this is an odd digression from the straight line that Christianity Today had been running about what went wrong with Mars Hill. But because they interviewed Josh, because it is an episode in the Mars Hill series, I'm doing a review in this particular video. Thank you so much for watching the review. This is episode 8, and it is called I Kissed Christianity Goodbye. Now, Christianity Today did justify interviewing Joshua Harris. It is their way of explaining why they inserted this discussion into a series on Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. Nevertheless, there is something about it that just feels a bit off topic. It's like writing it's like writing a biography about Douglas MacArthur and then just willy-nilly inserting a chapter on George Patton, one of his contemporaries. It is as though Mike Hosper, the narrator of this series, moved from the rise of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, the rise and fall of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, to the rise and fall of Josh Harris and Sovereign Grace Ministries. It seemed like it'd be better just to do an entire podcast series on the rise and fall of Josh Harris and Sovereign Grace Ministries. Their justification for doing this is they want to talk about celebrity pastors, and so they have juxtaposed Mark Driscoll, a celebrity pastor, with Joshua Harris, a former celebrity pastor, and so that is why they are talking about Joshua Harris in a series about Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. Now, this particular episode is divided in two parts. The first part of the episode, Mike Hosper and Joshua Harris talk about Sovereign Grace Ministries. And then the second half, the back half of the interview with Josh, talks about Josh Harris and some of his personal struggles. And so this review will be in those two parts. Part 1, Sovereign Grace Ministries, and then part 2, Joshua Harris. Now, for full disclosure's sake, some of you know this, many of you I imagine do not, but Lucia, my wife, and I first heard of Sovereign Grace Ministries in 2002. Eventually, we were part of a Sovereign Grace Ministries church plant here in Greenville, South Carolina. That happened in August of 2003. After that, I came on board as an associate pastor for a number of years, and then Lucia and I and our family finally left the Sovereign Grace Church and Sovereign Grace Ministries at the end of 2008 because of the corruption and the sin on the local level, as well as some things that were going on within the broader ministry of Sovereign Grace. So the first part of this episode between Mike Hosper and Joshua Harris, again, it's about Sovereign Grace Ministries. And as it began, Mike Hosper said that Sovereign Grace branded itself as friendly and humble, which sounds like premeditated intent is what Mike is saying. Because what you do is you decide what your brand is, and then you build yourself according to what you decided the brand is. I would assume that Mike Hosper misspoke at this point. I think that if he could say it again, he would say it differently, because I just don't think it's accurate that Sovereign Grace sat down and said, hey, we're going to be the friendly, humble people. That's our brand. Now let's go iterate that. That's not what happened, at least not according to my perspective or my experience. I would say, however, that it would be more accurate to describe it as ignorant arrogance. that Sovereign Grace Ministries, many people, including myself, within Sovereign Grace Ministries became very arrogant, but we were ignorant of our arrogance. We were ignorant of our unique gospel iteration. Now, that's not an odd thing. It reminds me of my fundamental Baptist days. God regenerated me in 1984. I went into a Baptist movement called Independent Fundamental Baptist. And I would tell you, I mean, it's an absolutely true statement. I was totally sincere in my arrogance as an independent Baptist, and my friends were too. I don't think that my friends were insincere. They were genuine people, but they did not have the self-awareness, and they became very arrogant, and so it was ignorant arrogance. I was sincere, but I was arrogant about my legalism that reeked to high heaven. I mean, as independent fundamental Baptists, we knew where to go, where not to go, what to wear, what not to wear, who to associate with, who not to associate with. We were an arrogant people, but very sincere. But then when God began to wreck my life, to be honest with you, and then I began to see that you're very arrogant and you need to see it. And then when I began to see it, that began to change everything dynamically. Well, that best, in my view, describes Sovereign Grace Ministry. We were a superior ministry. We were reading too much of our own headlines. We were listening to the press just a little bit too much. Some of us became aware of our arrogance, and we were no longer ignorant. We were self-aware, and that became very disillusioning and problematic, and that was one of the reasons that I left. Joshua said it this way, in a very succinct way in this interview. He says it was about being proud of our humility, and he is absolutely correct. Sovereign Grace Ministries fell into the trap of arrogant superiority that compared themselves with everyone else, mostly in an unspoken way in our own hearts, but sometimes we said the quiet part out loud. We talked about ourselves a lot, usually comparing ourselves with other people and usually putting the superiority, or we are better, putting the accent on us. And so it was an ignorant arrogance rather than a premeditated thing. It was kind of a funny story in the episode, the podcast, where Joshua Harris was talking with Don Miller, and and Josh was explaining to Don how great we are, and Don said, for people who talk about humility so much, you really talk about your humility a lot. You talk about yourself a lot. And Joshua said, just like, boom. And I remember that. I mean, not that particular meeting, but that happened to me as well. I began to grow in self-awareness that, it's kind of like what Job said to his friends. You are the people, and truth is going to die with you. And as I began to see those things, then I began to see more insidiousness within the local church level, but then also in the larger ministry. It reminds me of what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10:12. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, where he says, not that we dare to classify ourselves or to compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. That is a beautiful verse, and depending on where you land, on which side of that verse you land on, if God has worked those things out in your life where you see more of an equality within the body of Christ and not this arrogant superiority, then you're in a good spot. And so the first part of the episode was about Sovereign Grace Ministries. The second part, Mike Hosper and Josh began to dig down a little bit deeper into Joshua's own heart. And two of the themes that came out in this interview, to put it in a word form, there were two words: immaturity and ambition. And I recognize those words because I have owned them myself. And when you mix immaturity with ambition, those become the ingredients that lead to a lot of arrogance. And that's what happened in my fundamentalist days. I had been saved for about 30 seconds, and so I was immature. Within a year, I was in Bible college, and the idea was 4 years later, I would be in a pastorate somewhere. And so in a 5-year time frame, an unregenerate person goes from regeneration to being in a pastorate, that's immaturity. That's a setup for failure. But then you mix in selfish ambition to an immature soul. Well, then that leads to a whole lot of arrogance. And that's where I was. I would like to think that I've grown a little bit past that, but I know that those issues can still be there. And one of the things I appreciated about Josh is that he admitted in this episode that he's always been ambitious. He noted that a lot of his life journey was selfish ambition. He said, quote, "I wanted the acclaim, the best-selling book, the security and being in the right camp." He, like me, had no insight, no diagnosis on his heart, the immaturity of his heart. There was also no governor over it. There was no one standing out there like Gandalf and says, you shall not pass. And so with no one giving clear-cut, courageous accountability to him and having no analysis of his own heart motives, his ambition was running wild, and it was born out or is growing out of that immaturity. And so that ambition and immaturity formed the basis for I Kissed Dating Goodbye. His early promotion and immaturity were the basis of his one and only pastoral stint. He was in acceleration ministry mode. And then what he has done now is that he has moved past the pastorate and he has reinvented himself in the business world as a brand builder, helping businesses and bloggers and so forth. But one of the points that came out in this episode, it wasn't framed this way, but as you listen to what happened, Josh's immaturity and his ambition is still damaging souls. Here's the illustration that they gave. Mike Cosper talked about a lady named Jessica Vander Weingard. She's a film producer, a documentarian, and she got together with Josh and then she pitched the idea of doing a film on the deconstruction of the purity culture. Now, you mix that idea of making a film with an immature person with a lot of selfish ambition, it's like they're going to say yes, but they still haven't grown up yet. And so there's no way that this can go well. Well, after the film was produced in July of 2018, Joshua walked away from his marriage. After that, he walked away from Christianity. Well, guess what was left? Jessica had no film, and then all the folks who had gave the money to produce this film, they lost their money, and they had no film because the film company pulled out, which was the right thing to do to stop the film. And so that is an illustration of how Josh's immaturity and selfish ambition, it is continuing to cause damage in people's lives because he hasn't figured it out yet. Now, one of the things that happened at this point in the episode is that Mike Cosper, Christianity Today, he positioned the discontinuance of this project as Jessica hanging her hat on a celebrity and then feeling left disappointed when the star fell. And that was unfair. That was just unfair. Our natural default is to default to truth. We default to trust people. That is how God has made us. And when a guy comes along who appears to be honest, he iterates as transparent, he iterates as humble, he iterates as he's finally figured it out now that he's out of Christianity and he's redefined himself, and so this is who he is, well, then it would just make sense. Hey, let's get together. You have finally grown up, Joshua Harris, and so let's collaborate. But rather than talking about that, Mike Cosper has done something that it's actually what he wanted to talk about. He wanted to talk about celebrity preachers. That's what this episode is about. But rather than putting the main problem on the celebrity preacher, he put the problem on the person who hung her hat on the celebrity preacher. And I just thought that was unfair to Jessica. It's almost like in this series, the entire series that Mike Cosper is putting together, he's like a preacher with an idea in search of a text. So many times he eisegetically reads in the circumstances because that is what he's looking for. Rather than judging Jessica with the motive of where she wants to hang her hat, this is an ongoing pattern with Josh Harris. His immaturity and his ambition blinds him to what he's doing to people, and he leaves people broken in his wake. And like so many other celebrity pastors, whether it's Mark Driscoll or James McDonald or Tully and Chivijan, Josh needs to get a job on a production plant floor, a machinist somewhere, rather than continuing to hurt people because he wants to feed his selfish ambition. And then once he does figure out what he wants to be when he grows up, maybe he can start a ministry. But what happens so often is that these preachers who implode and do a lot of damage, C.J. Mahaney would be another one, they just resurface. C.J. leaves Gaithersburg and pops up in St. Louis and continues to do ministry. These preachers just need to set ministry aside, go get on the production floor, run a machine for 5 or 10 years, work out whatever it is that's got them all entangled, and then if God has a ministry for them, maybe that would be the time. But the issue here was more than Jessica wanting to hang her hat on a celebrity person. Again, I think that was unfair. This was Josh's ambition that continues to drive him while he hurts people. Now, there's irony here, and I don't want you to miss the irony. Mike Cosper is critiquing Jessica Vander Weingard for the temptation of hanging her hat on a celebrity. At the same time, he took a significant digression in this series to talk about a celebrity that really has nothing to do with this, hardly has anything to do with this series. And so you have to ask the question, is Mike Cosper hanging his hat on a celebrity too for clicks, likes, and listens? And so I thought that was a little bit ironic. And then the final point that I want to make in this review of episode number 8, there were several times where you would hear Joshua blame the problems on the church culture that shaped him. Now, there is truth that church culture and other things come into our lives and they do bring shape to us. But it would be more accurate to say that Sovereign Grace Ministries' way of doing church, it drew Josh's craving heart from the West Coast to the East Coast to C.J. Mahaney's basement and later to C.J. Mahaney's pulpit. There was a lot of talk about what church culture does to us. And again, I'm not mitigating, I'm not minimizing what anything could do to us. Those things are true, but it's about accent mark. Is it true that greater is in us than that which is in the world? Well, if that is true, then the heat and the disappointments that come into our lives, they can bring shape, but yet we can overcome them because of the grace of God that is potently active in us. And I'm not saying that like a disconnected Christian. I know what it's like to go through a divorce. I know what it's like to lose your children. I know what it's like to lose 2 brothers to murder. I know what it's like to be abused for 15 years by a drunken alcoholic father. Those things do bring shape to a person's life. But God's grace is greater. And there was this running theme throughout this episode to where the accent mark was on how bad church culture is. Church culture is bad in a lot of areas, but we are better than that because of the grace of God that's in us. A verse that communicates this is James 1:14 and 15. James said it this way: each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then when desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so it'd be more accurate to say, it'd be like the alcoholic saying that alcohol made me this way. Well, it wouldn't shape you this way if you didn't have a desire for alcohol. If you had no desire for alcohol, you could jump into a swimming pool full of alcohol, swim in it for days and days and days, and it would not shape you at all because you have no desire. But it's our desires that lead us to bad places, and then those places will bring shape to us because of our craving hearts. And so Josh's immaturity and his selfish ambition has led him to write the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, for example, to propel himself into the pastorate, again, where he damaged more people. And now he's doing it again as he's rebranding himself, redefining himself in another aspect of his life. Now, Mike Hosper did astutely draw out Josh's motives by saying that his new journey in storyboarding and branding and so forth, that this new journey is not the solution, because the problem has been sitting in Josh's heart for decades. And that's the point that really should have been coming through all along. It's not about where you are now, not about where you were, not about the book that you wrote. It is, in a sense, in a secondary sense, a tertiary sense. But the solution, the problem has always been sitting there for years. And I am very glad that Mike Hosper made this point, though it does feel buried under a lot of misfires and misdirections. Josh seemed not to hear what Mike was saying as he kept the focus on the church's failures. But I do want to be fair. This was an interview with Mike Hosper and Joshua Harris. We only heard the audio version. And I know that when you do interviews, there's more that's said outside of the interview of what people will actually hear than there's more said outside than what people actually hear. And so it may be that Josh did hear that. I trust that he did. That his solution is not going to be found where he is now. It was not found where he was. And those things are not the causes, but it is his heart that's craving, selfish ambition, born out of immaturity, that's leading to fractured relationships, whether it's his wife, Jessica Vander Weingard, or other people that he has influenced in an adverse way. And so I am reviewing episode number 8 in the Christianity Today series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And they inserted this interview with Joshua Harris. And so there is the review. If you have any questions about that, you're welcome to jump on our Ministries forums. We have free community forums that are for anyone. You can talk about this. You can talk about anything that you want. If you appreciate our videos on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and also share them with as many people as you can find. Thank you so much for watching.